well, we can thank you very much for staying with us. That's the second panel of the conference, trying to operationalize a little bit the discussion concerning dynamic effects and dynamic capabilities and dynamic competition in the context of merger control. So we are very happy to have with us today Matias Pietola from the European Commission. Matias has actually been working, is currently working, as far as I know, on the guidelines, particularly these dynamic effects perspectives. So we'll be very happy to hear from him about the current thinking, a state of economic thinking at the Commission regarding this topic. So Matias, the floor is yours, and then we will basically have a round of discussion with the various panelists. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ioannis, for invitation to this remarkable event. And it's a privilege to open the panel. My goal is to shed some light on how economists at the Commission view dynamic competition in merger control. Some of these insights come from the discussions with my colleagues, but I must emphasize that these are only my personal views and not the views of the Commission. So I was listening to the previous panel, and many speakers mentioned the debate on the interplay between innovation and competition. Goes back to Joseph Schumpeter and Kenneth Arrow. Schumpeter arguing that excessive competition post-innovation can render innovation unprofitable, whereas Arrow contends that it is competition that drives innovation. And we have the work of Philippe Aghion and co-authors that derive this famous inverted U-shape between the relationship competition and innovation, which has been very influential. And the first point that I want to make is that the inverted U is not really applicable or relevant for merger control. Why is this? It's because a merger is not merely a change in the intensity of competition. It's a structural change that brings together the assets of two firms and coordinates the decisions of those firms. And there's an entire literature out there on studying specifically the effects of innovation, effects of mergers on innovation, and this literature doesn't find an inverted U. So I think it's a good idea to stop talking about the inverted U in the context of mergers. What I would propose is instead to shift focus on the incentives of the merging parties. Innovation theories of harm are not inherently more speculative just because they concern the future. We are not trying to predict the future shape of markets. Instead, we are focusing on how the merger changes the incentives of the firms today, and I think this is the key for robust merger control. Not speculative claims about the future. So what do we mean by incentives? Do we mean incentives to invest in R&D, or do we mean incentives, pricing incentives, or do we mean both? I would say that we should look at both pricing incentives and innovation incentives simultaneously. These are inherently connected, and they should be analyzed together. There can be some specific circumstances where it's not relevant to look at price effects, but broadly speaking, this is my second point, that innovation and pricing incentives are linked and they require a joint analysis. So consider two firms, each investing in R&D to create a new consumer product, and after scrutinizing the usual things, R&D specialization, different capabilities, nature and scope of innovation efforts, sometimes projected substitutability with other products. We conclude that indeed the merger destroys innovation competition between the parties. This direct adverse impact on innovation incentives, where the successful innovation by one party cannibalizes the sales of other, this is the arrow effect. But that's not the only effect. The fact that the firms compete in the innovation space, it also means that they are likely to compete in the future product market. So if there are close competitors in the innovation space, chances are that there are close competitors in the future product market. So there will be an adverse impact in the product market. So not only will the merger reduce innovation, but it also tends to increase prices in the future. But then hold on a second. If the merger leads to higher prices, then doesn't this mean that innovation becomes more profitable? And indeed, here comes the third indirect effect, which I would call the Schumpeterian effect, which stems from the increased market power in the future product market. So we are in a way back to Schumpeterian arrow, but we are not back to the inverted U. The challenge with the Schumpeterian effect is, of course, its nature. It derives from the anti-competitive effect in the product market. So it comes with pricing harm to consumers. And my reading of the literature, the IO literature in particular, is that this effect is too weak for consumers to gain from the merger. So either the positive impact on the innovation deriving from the Schumpeterian effect is overshadowed by the direct loss of innovation competition, the arrow effect, or is negated by substantial pricing harm to consumers. So therefore, absent merger-specific efficiencies, we tend to look at the merger in a similar way as a static merger. The greater the concentration, the more dangerous the merger is for dynamic competition. Of course, the metrics can be different. Instead of looking at market shares, we might look at the R&D expenditures and the shares of those, but the underlying idea there is pretty much the same. And this also ties to the empirical literature that Howard Lansky was mentioning in the first panel. So my third point is that without specific efficiencies, a merger between competing innovators harms consumers. Either innovation goes down or it doesn't go up enough to compensate for the higher prices. And this harm is more significant when the market is highly concentrated. My fourth point concerns innovation efficiencies. So mergers are structural changes. So to offset the harm, equally long-term benefits are needed. So the incentive to dynamically compete must increase through the merger. I think there's a little point in short-term projects or innovation remedies if the underlying incentives there are not good long-term. If in more traditional mergers, we don't accept remedies like parties agree not to raise prices for 5 years. So I think the same thing applies here. Okay, so what do we then need for an innovation efficiency? as I said, the incentive to dynamically compete must increase through the merger. And as the merger, by definition, eliminates all competition between the merging parties, then this means that the innovation efficiency needs to be something that improves the position of the merging parties in the innovation race against their competitors. If you like, innovation rivalry enhancing type of an efficiency.
But, I mean, can I ask you? But
yeah, sure.
If it's actually a firm with market power in this case,
Yeah.
will that somehow be considered? I mean, it's like an innovation offense, you know. I mean, you know, your argument might work in the context where you have, you know, a much more competitive type of structure. But I mean, in case you say, well, you know, if it would improve the ability, I mean, the incentives, let's say, of you know, just the incentives of this of the firm following the merger, to innovate, and that is something that you consider as positive.
So you're talking about the merger to monopoly in a way that where you don't. So my point is,
it could be like you know, merger. Let's say that will enhance the capability, the incentive of the firm to innovate.
I think it's important that there's some outsiding firms that the parties are competing against.
And doesn't matter if the outside firms could be, you know, like small.
Well, if they are small, then there's the question to what extent the benefits from higher innovation are passed on to consumers. You need to have some discipline from outsider competition to at least to increase the pass-through of the innovation efficiencies to the consumers.
So after the Schumpeterian effect, you need also to see how this could be eventually shared in a way with consumers. I mean, I don't understand.
Yes, I mean, indeed. If it's just, I mean, I would be looking at the dynamic consumer surplus, including the price that the consumer has to pay. So if of course, I mean, innovation can go up, but then if all the benefits are pocketed by the companies, then it's not good for consumers. So that's my point.
Okay, so that would be like all right, sorry,
But I think broadly speaking, the key for efficiencies is complementarity, some sort of complementary technologies or complementary demands or technological spillovers. I mean, there's no inherent assumption that mergers in dynamic settings are less prone to anti-competitive effects. But I think, I mean, spillovers are prevalent in innovation contexts. So, and true innovation is non-rivalrous. The benefits can be shared with other firms, and lower innovation costs can be achieved through complementary scales. So I think that in these dynamic settings where innovation is a key parameter of competition, the efficiencies can be very relevant in the assessment. The same is not true for physical investments. If you have a factory, it doesn't produce more output just because it's owned by two firms instead of one. So I would make a distinction there. Finally, let me say a few words on less restrictive alternatives to the merger. Instead of pursuing the full merger, the parties may also achieve synergies through research joint ventures or through licensing deals. Again, I think here we should pay more attention to incentives. Do the parties really have an incentive in the counterfactual to sign the agreement, or is it only a remote possibility? It's not very helpful if there's a theoretical possibility of signing some deal to achieve the efficiencies. I think we should be paying more attention to the incentives and really the likelihood of that agreement happening in the absence of the merger. And even if the less restrictive alternative is a realistic alternative to the merger, I think there's still the question Are the contracting frictions that prevent the parties fully from realizing the efficiencies? Or are there still some merger-specific efficiencies left? And these questions, in my opinion, should be carefully analyzed before jumping into a conclusion that efficiency is not merger-specific. And this is my fifth and final point. So let me just summarize the main points. I think we should stop talking about the inverted U in the context of merger control. It's not very helpful. Innovation and pricing effects of mergers are linked and should be analyzed together. That's the point number 2. Absent efficiencies, a merger between competing innovators is harmful to consumers. Either innovation goes down or doesn't go up enough to compensate for higher prices. For innovation efficiency is something that improves the position of the merging parties in the innovation contest against outsiders. I think that's key. And finally, we should be a bit more, I would say not lenient, but we should look at the incentives to sign the less restrictive alternatives. It's just if there's a theoretical possibility of signing a deal absent the merger, I think it's not enough. So those were the points, and thanks for your attention. Now eager to see listen to what the others.
Sure. Thank you very much, Matias. It was very, very helpful. Actually, interesting that you focus mostly, I would say, on incentives. And while in the first panel we have been discussing a lot about capabilities, it seems that incentives stick around. And this is definitely important. So that's, I think, quite interesting difference with the first panel discussion. And I'm also intrigued by the less restrictive to competition alternative argument. I mean, I would suppose that in some cases you have some of these companies being in an ecosystem and they are complementary, and somehow they have some kind of interaction, and then they decide eventually to buy them. Well, in this case, I would suggest that you probably say that there's a less restrictive to competition alternative. You were basically working together before in the context of the ecosystem. There's no need for you to merge, and as far as I understand, that type of merger could eventually not fly. I mean, in terms of the analysis, but maybe I'm wrong. But this is something to discuss. Eventually, I'm thinking a little bit about, I mean, mergers like Booking Travelli, etc., where you had some form of interaction happening before as well. And if it's an argument to say, well, you can basically do that. You can achieve this innovation efficiencies just by being part of an ecosystem. There's no need basically to do mergers. Let me now turn to Ana Sofia Rodriquez, who, apart from being a member of the board of the Portuguese Competition Authority, is an excellent economist who has been doing a lot of work on innovation economics. I mean, I shared this information from previous discussions with Sofia about endogenous sunk cost theory and more generally, the work of Philippe Aghion. So, Ana Sofia, the floor is yours. Your perspective on the topic, and how to deal with this innovation in dynamic effects in the context of mergers.
Thanks a lot, Ioannis, for those kind words. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be in this wonderful panel with friends and great experts. I will start with some broader comments on the debate around further incorporating dynamic competition in merger control that is taking place around the revision of the merger guidelines, and then I'll zoom in some specific issues. Now, my first point is that now we are hearing a lot of claims, to some of them piggybacking on one or two specific points of the Draghi report, claiming that we need to further incorporate dynamic competition into merger control, and claiming, in my view, with no unfounded claims that agencies have overly focused on static effects and on prices. And I think that is quite of a misrepresentation, because I think the Commission took the lead throughout the years in introducing innovation and dynamic competition considerations into merger control. It's absolutely untrue that we only focus on prices and static effects. And the Commission did so, and also other agencies, by assessing mergers in sectors like pharma, like biotech, like medical devices, like agrochemicals, but also with the literature to which Matias has referred, that was developed by economists that are now the chief economist at DigiComp, but also economists that were in the past in the chief economist team. But also in these mergers in these sectors, the approach that the Commission and other agencies have taken allow them to consider impacts on quality, on diversity, for example, by looking at the risks that a merged entity after the merger could have incentives to divert R&D away from parallel projects or shut them down altogether. Looking at the risk of having killer or reverse killer acquisitions. And that focus was right, as we saw later on with empirical work on that topic. Another area where so many advances has been made is on addressing the risk that a merger could bring harm to innovation competition at earlier stages of R&D, and that called for a tuning in of both relevant market definition and theories of harm to capture innovation competition at those stages of the R&D process that will then map into wider innovation areas. And a lot of metrics have been developed in these decisions in order to assess firms' research capability and efforts, which were addressed so often in the past panel. Agencies look at R&D spending, at expertise, but also at assets like research labs, like headcounts. They look at the track record of firms in terms of introducing innovation into given markets. Agencies have also looked, of course, at the strength of patent portfolios in terms of the number and quantity of patents, but also in terms of forward citations. And they have tried to compute market shares or patent shares in this case in order to assess if merging parties were close competitors in terms of innovation spaces. In terms of digital mergers, of course, that is more difficult because it is much more difficult to predict where entry and potential competition might come from in the innovation space. Luis Cabral referred to it in a very illustrative way in one of his papers, that pharma, which is much more structured in terms of R&D, if it looks like war, then digital is terrorism, because you never know where the threat is coming from. But even there, and Ioannis, you mentioned this earlier, we have been, we made important steps on trying to develop ecosystem theories of harm, on focusing on the risk of eliminating potential competition, and by looking at internal documents, although we have learned that has some limitations. So all in all, what I want to my first point is on stating that the Commission took the lead on this. And back then, the approach was received with criticisms that it was highly speculative. So it's good to see that mindset seems to have changed since then, and that now we are seeing so many claims in order to incorporate dynamic competition. Of course, these claims emerge more in the context of efficiency claims than theories of harm. But it was the Commission that led this move towards a more dynamic and innovation-centric approach to merger control, and rightly so. My second point is that I think that in having this discussion, we need to bear in mind where the real problems are. And we have learned a lot lately about the innovation ecosystem in Europe, one that is focused mostly on incremental rather than disruptive innovation, One that has surprisingly stable R&D rankings that signal lack of contestability, and also an innovation ecosystem that is not keen on risk-taking. And the main differences vis-a-vis the US are not, of course, merger control, but rather the lack of venture capital and the pro-competitive industrial policies a la ARPA and DARPA, and not merger control. Now, my third point is that bearing all this in mind, we must be very much aware of path dependencies and incentives of incumbents to protect their current assets and to avoid cannibalization. So all this can depress incentives for meaningful innovation, and it might also prompt some incentives in order to neutralize potential sources of competition through killer acquisitions. This can happen particularly in the digital space, but also regarding sustainability. So I think we need to keep focused on innovation-related theories of harm, look closely to new types of deals, such as, for example, acqui-hires that have innovation at heart. Now, my fourth point is on innovation-related vertical theories of harm involving potential competition. There, I think estimations of incentives to foreclose can be both quite difficult and less informative, and they may fail to capture the risk that down the road there is going to be harm. So in those cases, I think it's much more adequate to put relevance on ability to foreclose, particularly when a merger might bring insurmountable bottlenecks that too many prospect of contestability and innovation in the longer term, as it was the case in Ilamina Gray. Now, my fifth point is on efficiencies. There's a lot of claims that there's no role for efficiencies within these assessments of innovation within merger control. But there are examples of that. A merger's impact on the degree of appropriability is often assessed in pharma mergers by the Commission, looking at the strengths of IP rights protection, the rate of imitation, in order to assess the degree of appropriability pre-merger that could give rise to a pro-competitive effect. Now, on the debate of innovation defense, I would like to emphasize the relevance of merger specificity and the absence of alternatives of less anti-competitive means to achieve those efficiencies, because otherwise we are going to be consciously targeting a second best scenario. And I fully agree here with Aro Shalansky's point in the previous panel, when he said that you don't want to be risking sacrificing dynamic competition and rivalry for some marginal efficiencies. Now, still on efficiencies, a note on out-of-market efficiencies. There are some that have been claiming that one should look at out-of-market efficiencies within this context of innovation in related markets to that of the relevant market. And here I stand by the Commission's option regarding sustainability agreements in Article 101, in which the Commission introduced a limiting principle by which, in order to ponder out-of-market efficiencies, they must accrue to the consumers of the relevant market, and they must at least compensate them. I think if we don't do that, I don't think we have the democratic legitimacy to be engaging in balancing between different markets, because that's basically taxing some consumers to the benefit of others. My sixth point, and I only have one more, so it's 7. My sixth point is on time frame and uncertainty, and here I think that a 2-year time window that is foreseen in the soft law of the Commission is necessarily inadequate to be adjusted to dynamic competition. I think we need longer time frames to capture longer innovation cycles, but also other concerns, which I think will be touched upon later on, such as resilience, so that we can perform prudential merger control. So I think we need not longer timeframes, and 2 years is not enough. However, whenever I try to get a number on, I can never get my mind to feel tranquil about any specific number. So I think that the time frame must be case by case and must be related with the duration of innovation cycles and other specificities of either the merger or the industry. Now, my seventh and last point has to do with the current push in many quadrants towards investment remedies. And there I would leave just a word of caution. First, because I think that they're incredibly difficult to monitor and to enforce. The real question is what happens down the road if you have incompliance. Are you going to unscramble the eggs and do the merger? And I think that such a regulatory approach is not consistent with a dynamic setting. You're not going to replicate innovation incentives. And I think that the debate is actually going the other way around, right? Which is regulation and innovation do not get along together. So why should they within the context of merger remedies? And I'll stop there. Thanks, Ioannis.
Well, thank you very much, Anna Sofia. That was very interesting, rich discussion. I mean, the European Union has the advantage of coming after the US has adopted their merger guidelines a couple of years ago, and now we have a few years of implementation of that. And one of the most important figures in developing the US guidelines, DOJ and FTC guidelines, is Aviv Nevo. Was at the time the chief economist of the Federal Trade Commission. So we're very happy, Aviv, to have you with us today and share, your views about, what has happened in the U.S. I mean, what are your perceptions about things that work, things that did not work out with the guidelines? I mean, maybe it's too early to say, but also what could be the lessons that the Europeans should draw out of the U.S. experience? Aviv.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I apologize for not being able to be there in person, but it looks you have quite an impressive setup. Although there's a scary character just over your shoulder, overlooking it. Anyway, let me start just with a quick disclosure. I don't think we're going to be talking specific cases, so I don't actually have any specifically to mention. But as you mentioned, part of my comments are going to be based on work that I did working on the merger guidelines in the U.S. But of course, any views are my own on that. So just to quickly kind of answer a question, if the guidelines work well in the U.S., they've worked absolutely fantastic. And I'm not biased at all in saying that. I'm going to focus really my comments on kind of lessons from what we've learned from these merger guidelines. And specifically, I think like my own lessons of actually working through them and understanding what's important, especially in the context of thinking about dynamics and innovation, which was I think an important part of what we were trying to do with the merger guidelines. So I think a useful place to start is to actually step back and ask, what are the general principles that we're looking for in competition policy in general, but specifically in merger control. So, the goal, in my view, the goal of competition policy is to preserve the benefits of competition, right? So a merger is anti-competitive if it basically, harms those benefits, right? What are the benefits? I mean, they're lower prices, they're greater greater selection, higher quality products, more innovation, if you're focusing on the product side. So a merger is anti-competitive. It sort of makes those go away and does through a mechanism of increasing or entrenching market power of firms. And I think that's important to remember. And when we think of those benefits, especially in a dynamic context, it's the benefits today, but also the benefits in the future, right? And this kind of goes to a comment that David Teese made at the very end of the previous panel, kind of just as I was joining. He made it sound as if it's a revolution in how we think about consumer welfare. I don't think it is. I think that's kind of always should have been the goal, that when we look at consumer welfare, it's expected consumer welfare, including what it is today and potentially into the future. This does, however, raise, I think, an important point, and that is the role of uncertainty. Merger policies is almost always, not always, but almost always ex ante policy. It's prospective policy. We're looking ahead as to what would be or what might be the likely effect of a merger. And we're always talking about what is the risk of a lessening of competition. So it's always, an exercise not in certainties, but in probabilities. And I think that's something that we've always sort of struggled as to what are the threshold, how certain do we need to be? And I think that's going to be even more so if we're going to start thinking about dynamics and innovation. And I think it's one of the things that we have to start paying a lot more attention to, both as economists and lawyers, and kind of think of what is the right framework of how to think about that, and what's a consistent way about to think about that. So, for example, Anna Sofia has talked about, well, what's the right framework to think ahead? Is it going to be 2 years? Should we look longer than that? I don't know that I have the answer, but I do think it's going to be important. I think agencies are going to have to figure out how to deal with that. That whatever answer they have, it's going to be consistent both on the potential harms or potential concerns, but also on the potential efficiencies, right? So I think in both of these, you can't kind of go to a world where you say, well, we're going to have concerns about potential harm to competition that are uncertain just by their very nature, and at the same time say we're not going to accept any efficiencies because they're speculative, right? So again, I'm not saying you should accept any sort of efficiency. I'm not saying you should be worried of any sort of harm, but we need to sort of think of what is the right threshold. Should there be some asymmetry? And I can see arguments as to maybe why there should be some asymmetry, but I think we have to sort of start really acknowledging the role of uncertainty. A couple of other sort of points that I think apply generally, but I think will again be very important to think about dynamics innovation. One is I think it's very important to have a single set of guidelines for all mergers. Historically, both in the U.S. and in Europe, there was horizontal and non-horizontal, or in the U.S., the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines and the 2020 vertical merger guidelines. I think it's important to have one set of principles for all mergers. Those of you who heard me speak in the past, I've said many times, we should start, classifying mergers as one way or another. We should think about what are potential effects, either pro-competitive, anti-competitive, and not worry, are they horizontal or vertical or non-horizontal, what they are. Let's focus on the substance and not on the labeling. And then the final point, general principle, is many of the issues that we deal with, I mean, even in the so-called vanilla, plain vanilla analysis of mergers are complicated. But they definitely get much more complicated once we move away to more dynamic industries where there's a relationship could be, a little bit more complicated, the usual just, two horizontal competitors merging. And there's a tendency to say we need to have analysis that takes everything into account. And I think eventually we might need to sort of do that, but I think we need to start simple. So we need to really start by saying, what are potential concerns? How do we articulate them? How do we sort of look at what are evidence that supports them? And if we actually say, well, there is reason to potentially be concerned, then we shift to start thinking about what are potential efficiencies, what are pro-competitive arguments for the merger. If we have none, maybe we're done if there were already reasons to be concerned. But if they are, then we can sort of engage in some sort of a balancing act. And I think, we have a tendency, especially as economists, to jump to the last stage. And sometimes, we need to do that. But I would say we need to get there eventually so we can actually build up the building blocks that's needed to it. So that's it in terms of general principles. Let me take just a few more minutes to kind of go into a little bit more specific. So, historically, and I think actually David Teese's comments at the end of the previous panel kind of reflect this very clearly. Historically, there was this view that merger analysis is static. It ignores innovation. And if you look at innovation and include dynamics, you're going to completely overturn the results. Okay, so suddenly all these mergers that were, anti-competitive and a static analysis, once you include dynamics, they're all going to be pro-competitive. And I think, David sort of reflects a thought that I've heard many times or expressed by others. I think where we've gone by starting to, in the last decade or so, maybe even longer, by thinking more carefully about innovation and dynamics, we've realized that, yes, that could be an argument like that, But more likely is that once you start thinking of dynamics and innovations, it actually raises additional reasons to be concerned, either on top of the so-called static analysis, pricing analysis, and I think Matias talked about these kind of go hand in hand, or independently. There might be cases that you might not be concerned directly about current static analysis, but kind of more future price analysis because of innovation. And that is something that we've definitely tried to elaborate on and kind of extend in the 2023 merger guidelines. And, we had different buckets. We've added, a specific guideline, talk about potential competition. It's not a new idea. It's one that's been around for a long time. But, specifically kind of mentioned this and discussing it. We've brought in theories of so-called entrenchment, when you have a dominant firm that might try to acquire another piece, kind of either think of it as a vertical component, something that eventually a rival could use to compete with it. So that's something that we've added. We've also brought in, considerations of trends of what's happening to industries, right? So either if you look a serial acquisition, right, of an acquirer that's actually been acquiring many firms, and maybe each one individually, each acquisition on its own, might not be problematic, but when you look at them as a whole, maybe they start being problematic. So again, that's kind of dynamics in a different way than just innovation, but I think it's all about, the dynamics of competition. Similarly, I think an important consideration is to look into trends. If there's a trend towards consolidation, there's a question when an agency should come in. Again, this is independent of innovation, but it's about the dynamics part of what we're talking about. And then finally, there is the innovation that interacts with all the above, but in some senses potentially also different. You could imagine a more quote-unquote static analysis, right, where there's two competitors that are currently competing in innovation, and they want to merge, right? And that, that I think fits in kind of your traditional analysis, just the way that you would analyze prices, you would analyze competition innovation. The difference is that the harm from this, yes, there'll be less innovation today, but in terms of the benefits that it will give you are somewhere in the future. So those are things that we did not add probably as much as we should have in the U.S. merger guidelines. And I think I've sort of stated in the past that if we had another round at it, I think that was one of the things to work on. And I know the DG Comp is very focused on it. I'm really hoping that the European merger guidelines will kind of pick up from where we left. My last comment is going to be on how to include some of these ideas in the guidelines, and I'll just say a few words on that. But before doing that, I just want to comment a little bit on the inverted U shape that Matias talked about. I agree with Matias, or let me say I partially agree with Matias in the following sense. I think that in some sense, the question posed that supposedly the inverted U shape is an answer to, in a way, it's not a well-posed question, or it's an ill-posed question. What do I mean by that? Asking what the relationship between innovation and competition is ill-posed because innovation and competition are both outcomes of some more primitive parameters of an industry, right? So in some sense, if you want to sort of say, as those more primitive parameters change, you will see things like, competition, especially if we're going to measure competition by either markups or by number of firms or by the concentration of firms. Those are outcome variables. They're not primitives. Okay, it's the primitives that determine those, and those same primitives are also going to determine the level of innovation and the incentives to innovate. So we can actually say, as we vary the underlying primitives, what does that actually do to the degree of competition, and what does that do to the incentives to innovate? And I think that's exactly what Matias was meant, I think, when talking about, well, we shouldn't be talking, that's not the relevant, the inverted U shape, whether it exists or not, is not the relative for mergers, because when we look at a merger, in some sense, we're changing that primitive, and we could say, how is that going to change, that merger going to change both the degree of competition that we see in the industry, you can measure it in a variety of different ways, and innovation incentives. Okay, so let me just go to my last point of sort of how to include some of the things that I've said before in guidelines. I think I have sort of 2 points to make here. One is I do think that when we start thinking, and this goes to the kind of the timeline and including uncertainty, we should start thinking as to whether when we talk about defining markets, historically markets are defined along two dimensions, the product dimension and the geography, right? That's kind of the two dimensions. If we're going to start thinking seriously about dynamics, I wonder if we need to be much more explicit about the timeline as well, right? So the time dimensions. So say we're talking about product X and geography Y at time period T. And that's going to make sure that we're consistent in thinking about both the harms and the both potential harms and potential efficiencies. So that's one thing about how to start, including dynamics and thinking about them in guidelines. The other thing, and this is a lesson we've learned in the U.S. merger guidelines, I would recommend as much as possible to stick with general principles and general ideas to kind of lay out the ground. There's always tempted to kind of provide very specific tools and very specific ways in which we can address the different concerns. But those are going to get very hard, especially when we talk about innovation and we talk about dynamics. Obviously, if the European Commission feels comfortable that there are tools that they can really outline and put more focus on, they should do that. But I suspect that that's going to be hard, and therefore I think it's much better to focus on here are the general principles that we look at, and here are possible tools that we might use, but without sort of becoming too specific. So with that, let me stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions if those come up.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. One short question, a little bit because of the discussion in the previous panel. What do you think about asset prices and more finance type of evidence base? Is it something that you took into account in the guidelines? You mentioned that you're not focusing on specific tools, but is it really something that you think that the Europeans should explore more?
So I think a general approach that we set in the guidelines is one should take a very holistic view of all the evidence and really look at everything from documents, evidence. So, in my own work, I've usually been a little bit hesitant to put too much weight on, hey, what is the price that was being paid, for example, for an acquired firm, and say, does this only make sense if you take into account, some other effects? I've always been a little bit hesitant to put too much weight on that. That being said, as one piece of evidence out of a much broader scope, you could look at that. And similarly, I'm not sure exactly what you had in mind in terms of asset pricing, but everything from market reactions to competitors and so forth. That's one piece of evidence. I wouldn't necessarily say that's the major piece of evidence, but again, the key is to take a holistic view and look at all the evidence that we have, and evidence can come in a variety of different forms. So I think that's a general principle that's important to preserve.
Great, thank you. Let's move now a little bit to the practice side. So we have, I hope you don't object me saying that we have two practitioners of merger control in a certain way, and because you do that your daily Latham, Matias as well, I guess. Oliver, Latham, Cecilia, Nardini, and Matthew Johnson. So I will start with Oliver, any remarks you have on the discussion and more generally on how to operationalize these dynamic effects analysis, dynamic competition analysis.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And I think hopefully I'll segue quite nicely from Aviv's talk, because I want to talk a bit about some of the specific tools and empirics that one might use to build that holistic evidence base that he was talking about, and potentially some of the experience from past cases of what's more predictive and what's less predictive of outcomes. Before doing so, I should start, I think, with a disclaimer and an apology. So the disclaimer is to say that I've worked on a bunch of merger cases involving dynamic competition. So that would include cases like PayPal, iSettle, Amazon Deliveroo, Visa Plaid, Adobe Figma, Microsoft Inflection. And I've worked generally with quite a lot of firms in the kind of technology and technology space and innovative industries. So Amazon, Microsoft, and others. I've also worked adverse to Google and Meta. So that's a disclaimer. The apology is to say that I'm a bit embarrassed to be joining a remote session from the other side of London rather than being there in person. But my excuse is that this is a symptom of one of the aspects of the practice of dynamic merger control, which is sometimes you get an unexpected set of RFIs with a very short deadline, which means you can't take time out of your afternoon to come in person. So I apologize for that. So in terms of tools, so obviously the challenge that Matias was talking at the beginning is, we don't need to make kind of full predictions about exactly how markets are going to look in 10 years' time, and I don't think it's realistic to expect people to do so. But we are talking about theories of harm which are forward-looking, and we do need to have some kind of element of thinking through what's likely to happen. And that means that we're not going to be able to rely on a lot of the traditional toolkit of empirical analysis that we would use in a traditional kind of static merger case. I agree with what Anna was saying, that there's obviously uncertainty, but the reaction to uncertainty can't be to say, oh, it's also uncertain that we shouldn't ever do anything to intervene. I think competition agencies have to make the best prediction they can with the data they've got available. And I think we're reaching the point now where we are starting to get a sense of what tools can be used. And I think we're also building a sort of casebook, if you like, of past cases where we can actually start to look back and say, okay, which of these cases did the predictions come out reasonably well, where less so, and what can we learn from those experiences? And so I think you can kind of think of a 2x2 matrix, if you like, of merger prohibitions and merger clearances, and then broadly accurate predictions and inaccurate predictions. And I wanted to kind of give an example of a case I've seen in each of those four cells, and then maybe draw some lessons from that. So I would use NVIDIA ARM as an example of a prohibition where I think the predictions worked out quite well. And so that decision was focused on this question of whether NVIDIA might foreclose rival developers of data center chips by limiting their ability to use ARM's intellectual property. And I think if you look back at that decision now, with everything that's happened since in the AI space, and there's already worries about NVIDIA's position across that AI stack, if they'd also owned the ARM IP, then I think it's credible to say that would be a worse outcome. And ultimately, the quite controversial at the time decision to take that forward-looking look at data centers has probably been vindicated. The next cell I'd like to look at would be a clearance decision that I think has aged well, which would be the UK side of the Visa Plaid transaction. And that was a story where you were worried about potential kind of open banking, kind of account-to-account based competitors to card-based rails. And Plaid was one of the builders of those sorts of solutions. And the way the CMA basically analyzed it was to say, we do think there's a dynamic threat to card payments from account-based solutions, but we think that in the specific case of the UK, Plaid is one of several disruptors who could play that role. And so the transaction's not going to kind of suppress that dynamic threat. And I think that's a nice natural experiment because it's an unusual case where it was cleared in the UK but blocked in the US. So you kind of have a clearance decision, but the merger didn't happen. And I would say if you look at the data there, it's broadly come out in a favorable way that, open banking's not taken off perhaps quite as well as people would have hoped, but there is a lot of innovation in that space. And I don't think Plaid has been particularly unique in a UK setting. Sort of cracking through to my next one, I would put MetaGiffy as an example of a prohibition decision that's aged poorly. So there you have the premise that Giphy would be a sort of entrant into online advertising and would compete with Facebook's kind of strong position in display advertising. And the outcome there has been that Giphy has basically been spun off. It's now a subsidiary of a firm called Shutterstock. And to my knowledge, it's not developed any kind of specific advertising technology or any particular space position in the advertising space. And then the final bucket I would point to as a sort of poster child for a clearance that aged poorly would be Google DoubleClick, which has often been pointed at. where the Commission cleared that on the basis of a lack of incentive to kind of engage in foreclosure strategies in the ad tech stack. But we've now had kind of multiple antitrust judgments basically saying that Google's done exactly that. So hopefully that's a useful kind of taxonomy to kind of set the scene and put some data points out there to then think through. So what would be my takeaways from that set of 4 cases? I'm not claiming that 4 is a big data set or representative necessarily, but just to try and put some specifics into the debate. What are sort of takeaways there? So I think the first is to say that kind of traditional static analyses are actually sometimes useful in a dynamic case, and we should try and use them when we can. So if the market's totally in flux and the merging parties are going to expand significantly and you're worried about future products that don't even exist, then obviously static analysis isn't going to get you very far. But something like the Visa Plaid case, where you've got multiple potential disruptors to an incumbent, I think you can learn something from our traditional toolkit like bidding data to look at how those potential disruptors are interacting, even market shares potentially. You can kind of learn whether a particular target is a kind of unique source of disruption or not. Second, I think building on Ioannis, your question to Aviv, I think valuation analysis, it's not a complete analysis, but I think it's a useful filter and should be taken seriously as part of that kind of set of holistic indicators when you're trying to build out whether a theory of harm makes sense. So I always thought that one of the red flags around the Metagiffy case, which I wasn't involved with, was that the sort of theory of harm to me just didn't really ring true with the value of Giphy as a business. I think it was a $400 million business. And, you know, you could see kind of even relatively nascent players in online advertising who were building kind of significant user bases already commanding like much higher valuations. So I don't think it was a complete answer, but it was a filter. I mentioned Microsoft Inflection, a case we worked on. I thought that the valuations there were a useful source of evidence because you could say, okay, you know how much Microsoft is paying to hire the sort of staff that were involved in that acqui-hire case. And then you could benchmark that and say, okay, how does that compare to VC funding of kind of other similar talent or similar startups? And I think that could give you a sort of reasonably objective metric to try and assess the uniqueness of the people involved. The third is that we've got to try, I think, to build out our economic evidence base to put numbers around firms' assets, capabilities, and incentives to try and, you know, we don't need to build a perfect prediction of how the market's going to look, but we want to try and at least get a sense for what the kind of key drivers in the market going ahead are. And I think the lesson with the double-click decision was that it didn't really, I think, grapple with predictable interconnections and how they were going to affect the market going forward. So my read of the decision is it basically said Google's very small in ad exchanges, DoubleClick's not that big in publisher ad servers, it would be costly to deny interoperability, so therefore it won't happen. But what you could layer on was to say, well, hang on, Google has got a position in search and YouTube and so on and so forth. If it kind of channels that demand through its own ad exchange and kind of simultaneously kind of reduces interoperability in both directions, there was a kind of mechanism for that market structure to change quite quickly. And so I think you want to try and see if are there empirical data points that will help you try and trace through how things could develop in a more holistic way. The final observation I'd make is, I think, to Anna's point around internal documents, is I think one of the risks for the kind of false positives, if you like, is when there is too much weight given to the specific advantages of the merging parties without thinking about what the rest of the market is doing. So if you have an extreme situation, like I don't know if Giphy had a pitch deck where it was saying, we're going to revolutionize online advertising because of X, Y, and Z, I think there's a question of, can we try and test with data whether those sorts of statements are the sort of natural things that a firm that's trying to raise money would say versus kind of genuinely unique sources of differentiation. So can you use market research on customers to see, do they really value the areas of differentiation that emerging parties are pointing to? Are kind of other sort of external reference points in terms of analyst reports and so on and so forth, are they supportive of this being a really unique differentiator? And as a sort of aside, my PhD was in, a bit randomly, looking at the accuracy of intelligence forecasts during the Cold War. And I went to a conference where there was the chief historian of the CIA. And he was asked, what is the main mistake the CIA has made throughout its history? And the answer he gave, quite paradoxically, was that they had an institutional bias towards overweighting secret information. So they would put more weight on their deep assets in a given country and not enough attention on stuff they could read in a newspaper or from speaking to the man in the street. And you can kind of see why you might do that, that you're kind of, if something's very costly for you to get, you put more weight on it. But his argument was that you have to kind of control that bias and make sure that you're kind of testing your secret information against your public information. And I think there's a bit of a corollary there in a sort of merger control context as well, when you're thinking about the kind of internal view versus external evidence. So that's all I was going to say. I think that it's a really kind of fascinating set of challenges we have as economists in these dynamic cases, to how to sort of create a structured and kind of logical framework to model how markets are going to evolve, and to try and take the sort of high-level frameworks Aviv was talking about and sort of assemble the data points to try and cast light on where those things are going to go. And that's always going to be, I think, case by case as to what data is most compelling. But hopefully that was interesting as to a couple of thoughts as to what can work and what cannot work in different settings.
Certainly was, and thank you very much. And particularly, the emphasis you put on post-implementation of certain types of mergers, I think it's very good to have that. One question I might ask you, maybe, and to the other practitioners, if I can use that term, is, is a current basically format of the CO, the kind of request of information of the Commission, is it adequate? Do you think that it needs also to be revised and eventually to cover this more holistic perspective on data that you need to have for assessing the merger? I don't know if you have any reaction to that, or Oliver, or?
I don't think so. I think that there's obviously already been a big shift in evidence, in the sense that there's obviously been this big shift much towards kind of internal documents and factual evidence over empirical evidence. And I think that's a totally reasonable reaction to theories of harm which are harder to test based on historic data. So I think that there has been a shift in how RFIs are done. I think it's about, learning what other sources of data besides internal documents can help shed light on things. But I think it's pretty par for the course now for regulators to say, give us analyst reports on the emerging parties, give us data on planned investments, on forecasts, and so on and so forth. So I think that the evidence gathering approach is moving, I think, broadly in the right direction. But I would be interested in others' views on that.
Excellent. Yeah, Cecilia, yes, go ahead. And that enables me to pass to the floor.
I would certainly agree with that. And I think it's a bit like the CIA example that you made before. It's not necessarily about the evidence that's being gathered, but how the evidence is interpreted and how the certain dots are joined. So I think in terms of the evidence being gathered, I would agree that, it's adequate at the moment.
So please go ahead with your presentation. Yes, of course.
Thank you for having me again. So today I would like to talk about sort of something.
I think the microphone moves, so you have to. Yeah, that's so fun.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Great. So I'd like to talk about something slightly different from what we've been talking about today in terms of sort of dynamic effects, and it's the concept of resilience. So with the confluence of significant technological, geopolitical, and environmental changes, there has been an increased focus on dynamic non-price objectives, as we've heard. And that includes competitiveness, security of supply, sustainability, and resilience really has emerged as a key objective of competition policy, and in particular, merger control. So just, quickly, what do we mean by resilience? Obviously, I think it's still an evolving concept, but I think in very simple terms, the definition that we can use is to think of resilience as the capacity of a market to absorb demand and supply shocks. So essentially to deliver reliable access to products traded in a market at reasonable prices. And in the definition, we have three components. One is supply diversification. Thank you. Supply diversification, which is sort of self-explanatory. Reliability, which is about sort of having enough capacity to serve demand, and then competitiveness, which is instead about the sort of cost efficiency of suppliers. So how is merger control relevant to all this? We're going beyond the slogans today. So I think we can say that mergers can increase or decrease the resilience of a market. And if we think specifically about horizontal mergers, on the one hand, a merger reduces the number of suppliers. So resilience concerns might arise because you lose, you have a reduction in the number of firms in the market, you have potentially less redundancy, and potentially less recovery or slower recovery from shocks or higher prices once the shocks are over. On the other hand, if you have scale and through consolidation, that can help support resilience. And a merger may avoid the exit of assets and firms, especially those that are relatively efficient. There is economic literature that tells us that mergers between industry laggards might help them increase their efficiencies, and therefore they might become better, more credible supply options. And so on. So really the key, I think, for us is to determine when and how the reduced rivalry in the marketplace can make economy more resilient dynamically, and whether those benefits offset any sort of potential risk of static price effects. I'm an economist, so I'm going to give you a very simple example to think about this, very sort of little model. So let's imagine a market where demand is declining but highly uncertain, and firms incur high fixed costs. And in every period, they decide whether to stay or exit from the market based on their expectations of future demand and their expectations about what their rivals are going to do. So, for example, if we have demand turning out to be lower than expected, the industry might end up being overcrowded. So there are too many firms and too little demand, and therefore, firms in the market make losses. And if this happens, for repeated periods, a number of periods, it would trigger a cascade of exits. If then you have a positive demand realization after this sort of multiple periods of negative demand shocks, and too many firms have left the industry, what you might end up finding is that the industry is undersupplied. So the market is unable to meet demand because too many firms have left. So prices go up and the remaining firms make sort of super competitive profits. So in short, this is a very simple example of a market that is not resilient because it's not able to absorb negative demand shocks, and there's a lot of volatility in prices and available capacity. What can merger control do in a market like this or in situations like this? Potentially, relaxing merger controls after a negative demand shock may, in fact, enhance resilience. And the mechanism of this has to do with firms' expectations. So if firms expect that merger control will remain strict, even in the face of downturns, they will anticipate that future negative demand will force them to exit, and therefore, and they will not have the option to consolidate to sort of, maintain viable scale. And so ex ante, they might just decide, I'm going to exit straight away. I'm not going to wait to sort of accumulate losses. If instead firms expect that the merger control will be flexible, then they might have greater incentive to remain in the market ex ante because they know that consolidation could be a potential safety valve that could help them in the case of sort of negative demand later on. And so in that sense, this kind of safety valve is something that stabilizes the market structure and ensures that, when the market recovers, there are still enough suppliers in the market to make sure that, prices don't shoot up. So really the challenge is to strike a balance and between these things. But I think the key message is that, in certain situations, at least, more relaxed merger control may be welfare superior in a dynamic sense if it avoids sort of, in this more dynamic sense, avoids a sort of catastrophic industry shrinkage or sort of cascade of exits and potentially monopoly price once the demand has recovered. I've been talking about exits. I think a very similar sort of mechanism or structural fragility is a reduction in capacity, but the intuition is very similar. So in practice, how do we assess this? There are various technical challenges. So first challenge is that concentration measures are not particularly useful. They do not capture resilience. So you can't really, structural presumptions are not particularly helpful because you can have a moderately concentrated market, but with two sort of fully interchangeable and reliable sources of supply, and that market might be more resilient than a more fragmented one where the sources of supply are not as sort of strong. Another technical challenge is that other sort of standard indicators that we normally use in the analysis, for example, closeness of competition, may also not necessarily be informative. For example, you can have a merger that eliminates a close competitor, and classic concern there might be that the reduction in the number of options available to the customers is going to be bad for consumers. But if this close competitor is, say, reliant on a vulnerable supply chain and all of that, the merger is not going to make the sort of resilience of the market any worse than it would have been otherwise. So really closeness per se is not an indicator of resilience in the longer run. In reality, really, then what we need is, as is often a case-by-case analysis, which goes beyond the calculation of market shares and diversion ratios, and looks at various things, including, for example, identifying actual and potential competitors, not just what they produce, what they offer, but also ideally their cost structure. So their sunk costs, their fixed and variable costs of operation, what their capacity is like and what their sort of forecast capacities are, vulnerabilities of their supply chains. Second thing is to look at demand and supply and the likelihood of shocks, so that we have an idea whether we might end up in a situation of excess demand or excess supply, and excess demand, as we said before, would lead to higher prices. We need to look at whether the merger is likely to increase the efficient use of production assets, and so sort of efficiencies, even in a sense, perhaps, even if those perhaps would not meet the current Commission thresholds for consideration. And essentially sort of aspects related to capacity and how firms might react to uncertainty in that sense. So really the focus should be with merger control to see if the decision in terms of merger control helps maintaining contestable and diversified supply options and avoids entrenching dominant firms, or whether it sort of creates a situation where in the longer term the market may be less resilient. Two quick thoughts to conclude. First, you might think that this sounds vaguely familiar. I think there's a similar concept, which is the failing firm defense that has been used in the past. Or, it's been sort of part of our toolkit for a long time. And indeed, conceptually, the rationale is similar. I think the difference with the resilience lens is that there is more of a systemic justification to the sort of consideration of these kind of issues. So rather than focusing on whether a firm would exit absent a merger, we think about whether a rigid sort of regime or prohibition of mergers would trigger broader exit cascades and ultimately harm consumers in that sense. And the second concluding thought is, what does this mean for the new merger guidelines? Obviously, we are not advocating for a sort of lenient or sort of blanket leniency by incorporating a resilience logic. But I think what would be quite useful is for the Commission, particularly in certain markets like the ones I was describing in the very simple example I provided,
the Commission should look at, really the probability of exit of firms in the face of uncertainty. So if probability of exit is highly, is high or is kind of sensitive to demand shocks, there is, a potential for consolidation to stabilize expectation and therefore potentially be positive in the longer run and increase consumer welfare in the longer run. The other thing to consider are sort of ex-ante incentives. So whether strict enforcement, as we were saying before, might actually induce premature exit because firms expect that they're not going to have any other way out. So they might just as well, exit ex-ante. But then competition will be reduced in the long run. And finally, again, a point on efficiencies. I think it's important that the Commission evaluates efficiencies, again, under a sort of resilience lens and think about whether the sort of efficiencies can enhance resilience and reduce systemic fragility.
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia. Very interesting. I mean, and also, I mentioned at the beginning that dynamic effects is not just about innovation. It can also actually be about the other considerations the Commission puts forward, like resilience. The question is, if you have, obviously the Commission would like, and I think it'd be interesting to hear from Matias as well, would like to achieve all of that. But I mean, in case you have to make trade-offs, how are you going to make them? Are you basically going to say, well, this is hierarchically more important to achieve? Are you going to take a lexicographic perspective, which means that you're going to try to achieve at least the minimum of each eventually, and its particular order. And then the question also about these, it was mentioned about the failing firm defense. And there I think it's interesting also because the third condition of the defense is that the assets, that the firm will leave. It's actually the assets would stay in the market, and the assets might stay in the market, but someone else might buy them, right? Or someone else might use them. So in a certain way, it's not just about the exit of the firm; it's about the exit of the assets, productive assets in question, which could be of interest. So very interesting food for thought for the discussion. I'd like now to turn to Matthew, give his perspective from a practice.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. First of all, some disclaimers. These are personal thoughts, not those of OXERA. OXERA and some of my colleagues are working on a study in this area for the European Commission. I'm not on the project team for that study, which I think allows me to speak a bit more freely.
Can you just speak closer to the mic if possible?
Yeah,
I know I think there's a mic next to you there.
This one here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry for that. But...
No problem. And yeah, finally, so I've worked up obviously on a wide range of merger investigations, including some with dynamic effects, which we'll talk about, typically for merging parties or for third parties. My work doesn't focus on a particular sector like big tech, but I have worked on some of the cases we'll talk about, and I'll try to flag when that's the case, when I've been involved in a case. So yeah, I think I kind of want to make three main points, which I think have been touched on to a greater or less extent by others, but perhaps I'm going to put it in a slightly different way. The first is predictable versus unpredictable innovation. Now, it's kind of a stupid thing to say. Of course, innovation is unpredictable. That's the whole point. But I guess what I'm saying is, and Anna had a good way of describing this before, which is sort of the war of attrition versus terrorism. So you have some markets where the mode of innovation is reasonably well understood. And I think their merger control can be and is being used to preserve that process of innovation. So, the cases that started this off, cases like Bayer Monsanto at the EU. And I think many practitioners have now accepted the principle that in the same way that you can have a loss of competition in prices or quality, you can also have a loss of competition in innovation. I think that is becoming more widely accepted. Even in those cases, I think you need to think carefully about how big is that harm. When you're thinking about loss of competition in price, for example, it's quite easy to measure because you have the price and you have the volumes. The benefits that you're getting from innovation that might be lost as a result of a merger really depend on the market. And you could imagine situations where innovation's happening, but it's over something not very important, new fancy colors for a car or something like this. Things which, yeah, it's great. You might call it innovation, but it's something which, if it was lost, consumers might not really value, might not miss it that much. So you need to really think about what innovation benefits are being lost as a result of that merger. And also, of course, how will competitors in innovation react to that merger, because if there are others innovating in that market, how are they going to react? When we have models of pricing and how competitors react to mergers in pricing, I think that's relatively well understood. We have models for that. When we're talking about innovation, I think it needs to be thought through quite carefully. But those are what I'll put into the sort of the more predictable innovation category. But then we've got those markets where they're nascent, or where the mode of innovation is very sort of lumpy or very unpredictable. And I think in those cases, it's harder to know what you need to preserve, or what might be lost as a result of a merger. In that sort of Bayer Monsanto situation, they've both got the research department and they're sort of doing research, coming out with new products. You can kind of see them, the mode of competition. In situations where it's a lot more uncertain how that's working, you don't necessarily have things just coming out of the research department each year. So I'm talking about cases like Meta Giphy, or even Facebook, Instagram, in terms of an older case. It's harder to know. So I think Ollie mentioned already Meta Giphy. This was a case where Giphy was starting to emerge as a competitor to Meta in display advertising. And it was doing this by starting to market sort of branded GIFs. So you could have a situation where then, Giphy might have a tie-up with Starbucks or something like this. So when you search in, I don't know, coffee or something, rather than just a coffee cup coming up as your GIF, it will be a Starbucks branded coffee cup or something like that. So there was a sense that, yes, you could see how that might be a competitor to Facebook at some point in display advertising. But obviously, it wasn't an important competitor now, and it wasn't going to be tomorrow, but it might be at some point in the future. But of course, there are lots of other kind of paths where maybe it wouldn't have become a competitor, someone else would have become a competitor. So it was all still quite uncertain. Facebook, Instagram, I'm almost loath to mention this one because it's been absolutely discussed to death over the years. So this was a case cleared at phase 1 in the UK, emails which were later sort of found and presented by the FTC in the US suggested that Facebook kind of knew or thought that it was buying a potential competitor at the time. So I think some people have decided, therefore, that this was a merger which maybe should have been blocked. But I guess what I would say is, at the time that the deal happened, Instagram was a company with 13 employees and no revenues. And yes, there was a state of the world where, without acquisition by Facebook, it would have developed into a really important rival to Facebook, but also many states of the world where it just wouldn't. Something else would have done better. Something else would have had a slight edge, and then therefore would have taken off. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is, in those cases, it's really hard to know what would happen in the counterfactual. And sometimes our sort of backwards-looking view of the counterfactual, because we can see Facebook now, we can see Instagram now, our backwards-looking view of what the counterfactual might have been is coloured in a huge way by what the factual is. Because yes, Instagram is big now, Facebook is big now, but who knows what would happen if we were thinking back at that time. So in those cases where there is a lot of uncertainty, very high levels of uncertainty, but could have a large impact potentially, if this merger is problematic, what do we do? Well, one solution which was proposed by the Furman Review in the UK is to have a balance of harms type test. So rather than just rely on the balance of probabilities for an SLC, you would allow the authority to intervene in situations where the probability of harm is less than 50%, but the extent of harm, if it were to materialize, is very high. So that was proposed by Furman and others in the UK, ultimately rejected by the UK government. But I think it's a really interesting potential way to get at those, or to start addressing those sort of small risk but big impact kind of cases. That's one solution. Perhaps even more radical is that some academics have argued that in cases where there's a lot of uncertainty about how markets will develop in the future and who are going to be the winners in the counterfactual if the merger didn't go ahead, ex-ante tools might just not be up to the job. Which is probably hard for us merger economists to hear, that there are things which we can't predict. And so the proposal of some of these academics is, let's just let these mergers go ahead, because it's too hard to know what bad things could happen, and the tools are just not up to the job. But if we're going to do that, obviously we can't just let these deals happen, because in some cases, there will be harm, bad things will happen. So in that case, you would have to have the tools to solve the problems ex post. So, for example, through enforced divestments, breakups, if these concerns begin to materialize. Now, of course, that really depends on whether you can sort of unscramble the eggs post-merger at some point much further down the line, which is easier in some markets than others. So I don't necessarily agree with that view, but I think it's a really interesting challenge, because I think it's quite often easy to think, how do we perfect the merger control tool? And maybe at some point, in some situations, the merger control tool just can't be perfected enough to solve the problem we're trying to solve. In terms of solving things ex post, obviously you've got standard competition law. Some people say it's a bit kind of clunky for getting at the issues we're trying to get at. In the UK, you've got the market investigations regime, which does allow you to investigate and potentially break up companies which have merged. That has happened at least once in the UK. And then obviously you've got the digital markets regime, which can help to sort of control bad outcomes in digital markets. The third point, which I think has been touched on before in terms of failing firm, but we do have already quite a lot of existing experience with dynamic counterfactuals. So authorities have a lot of experience in cases that go beyond simple static analysis of competition. So you've got sort of failing firm, flailing firm type defences. Cases that I've worked on, one was Archelic Whirlpool at the CMA, which was had a sort of flailing firm defence, and that fed into the phase 2 clearance. Interesting one, which I didn't work on, but was JD Sports Foot Asylum, which was a UK case involving sports footwear. And in that case, the parties did argue that Foot Asylum, the target, was a sort of a flailing firm. It wasn't immediately going to fail, but it was sort of struggling, would become a less important competitor going forward because it didn't have that sort of financial strength. CMA rejected that and blocked the merger. But since then, Foot Asylum, I think, has been struggling financially. So to some extent, that concern about flailing firm has been borne out. Other cases where you have dynamic counterfactuals, the Commission's been talking about this recently, is the Veolia Uniper, I think it's in Hungary, case, an energy sector case where the Commission cleared that even though immediately after the merger, market shares would be quite high, but the Commission had good evidence that new entry was coming into the market, and so therefore, looking forward in a dynamic way, it could be comfortable that that there wouldn't be harm to competition. You can also have cases where the counterfactual without the merger could be something which is more competitive than the situation at the moment. So let's say a company is sort of on the block to be sold. You've got the merger that's in front of the authority, but you may have a third party saying, well, we were kind of the second highest bidder for this. And if we'd won this company, if we bought this company, we would have made it more competitive than it is now. And so CMA had in some cases, so Bottom Line Experience was one that I worked on, where the CMA did entertain this idea that if someone else had bought this company, it would have become more competitive in the future. So lots of experience with thinking about those dynamic counterfactuals. I think one issue which would be really good to discuss and goes into this sort of question of developing the guidelines is the sort of evidentiary threshold, and also who holds the burden of proof for concerns about future harm versus evidence that harm might not occur in the future, either due to sort of market developments or dynamic efficiencies. Because I think if you look at the guidance, it's quite strict. Also, for example, on failing firm, the test is normally, is it inevitable that the firm would exit the market? That's obviously a very, very high test. In the Veolia Uniper case, the Commission said it had concrete evidence that there was going to be this entry. So these are quite sort of high thresholds for saying, well, this is not going to be a problem because of future developments. And I feel sometimes perhaps there isn't quite an equivalence of either the level of evidence that you need to have, or sort of who has the burden for that. So it may be something worth thinking about and discussing. I think those are my main points.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting points. First, the issue of the high impact, low probability type of events and what you do in this context. The second, which is your suggestion to err on the side of caution by somehow accepting the merger to go through, but then come up with a behavioral type of other ex post assessments. One might say, well, that could be quite, expensive as well and costly. And to a certain extent, one might take a precautionary perspective, say completely the opposite. Let's not, let the merger through. And eventually that could be another possible outcome in a certain way. Maybe we'll discuss that. Dynamic counterfactuals, and of course the issue of evidentiary thresholds. So now I would like to turn to take a more academic perspective on the topic. And we have Nicholas Economides from NYU, who has done a lot of work on network economics. Nicholas, any thoughts about the dynamic effects in a network economics type of framework, and then any suggestions for the Commission in the merger guidelines.
Sure. Let me share my screen.
Yeah.
Can you see? Okay.
You can
great.
see it.
All right. So let me start by saying, what do the words mean? What exactly does the dynamic competition means? For many theoretical economists, dynamic competition just means multi-period competition with sophisticated strategies. In fact, if you write the words dynamic competition in Wikipedia, you get a video by Glenn Ellison of MIT on multi-period games, nothing to do with antitrust. Okay, so for others like us, dynamic competition here means competition in innovation in new products, new processes that possibly make products cost less. Assuming that we're going to focus on that, on innovation. Arrow, long time ago, has shown that cost-saving innovation is more likely to be undertaken by a competitive firm than a monopolist, because a monopolist has a cannibalization problem. This is a very easy argument, easy to understand for everybody. But it's done under some very specific assumptions. And also doesn't cover new product innovation. Others, for example, Schumpeter, have argued that a monopolist, or more generally a firm with some monopoly profits, would be a more likely acquirer of a de novo innovator than a competitive firm. So let's try to focus on dynamic competition, that is potential innovation, when a merger is proposed. Let me go through some examples. Let me start with the easiest one. The merger is with the innovating firm. For example, Facebook buying Instagram. What would dynamic competition require? It would require examination of the proposed evolution of the merged Facebook Instagram company 5 or 10 years later. We have to ask these questions. What would have happened to Instagram if the merger were to be disallowed? Would Instagram have been bought by another tech giant? Would we have a Facebook Instagram duopoly? Would Instagram have displaced Facebook as a dominant firm? These were questions that should have been asked at the very beginning when the issue came up, but they were not. And we had a litigation many years later, and yesterday we had the DC court decision, which in my opinion was horrible because it failed on market definition. It failed to understand the causes of high profitability of Facebook. There were other misunderstandings in that decision. But suppose we're not talking about this easy case. I think Facebook, Instagram was an easy case compared to everything else. What can we do? We want to look at capabilities of new potential products and industry evolution. Let me call a case 2 a merger between producers of substitutes, of course, A1 and B1. But A1 has the potential or the capability of easily developing product A2, and similarly, company B1 has the potential or capability of developing product B2. And let's assume that pre-merger A2 and B2 have a 50 chance of being developed. Okay? And let me go now to sub-cases. Suppose now these two new products, A2 and B2, are in different markets. They're not in the same market. Then the merger might make the merged company A1, B1 financially stronger, and therefore both A2 and B2 are going to be developed post-merger, which is a win for innovation. Okay, so that's one possibility. Let's go further. Let's talk about case 2B. Now, the new products, A2 and B2, are in the same market. Then the merger between A1 and B1 would reduce innovation because it's unlikely that both A2 and B2 would be developed after the merger. So merger results in a loss of innovation. And additionally, there is a possibility that A1B1, the merged company, will extend its monopoly power to the market for A2 and B2. Okay. So let me go to another case. Case 2C. A2 is complementary to A1, and B2 is complementary to B1, but suppose their complementarity is in different dimensions. So A2 and B2 are not in the same market. They're in different markets, but each one is complementary to the one of the parties that are proposing the merger. Then the merger would increase the chance of innovation, both of them, A2 and B2, being developed, which is a win for innovation. Let me go to another case. This is a bit more complicated. Suppose A2 is complementary to A1, B2 is complementary to B1, but now this A2 and B2 are not capabilities of the merging parties. They are third parties that could be acquired by A1 or B1 when they were pre-merger, in pre-merger conditions, or by the merged company A1, B1. And suppose that without the merger, there is a 50% chance that A1 will acquire A2, or B1 similarly has a 50% chance that B1 will acquire B2, will be acquired by A2, will acquire A2 or B2. Now, if the merger is denied, there will be considerable competition between A1 and B1 for innovative acquisition targets, outside targets now, A2 and B2, and it's possible that A2 will be acquired by A1 and B2 will be acquired by B1. If the merger is allowed, it will result in a better financial condition for A1, B1. Then it will make it more likely that both A2 and B2 will be required by A1, B1. And remember, the A2 and B2 could be in different dimensions, not necessarily in the same market. But if they are in the same market, then the merged parties has the potential of extending its monopoly power in another market. So here, in this case, the merger of third parties with the acquiring firm increases innovation, okay, because these products are produced, but it may extend the merged company's monopoly power to another market if the A2 and B2 are in the same market. Now, this is a bit complicated, and you haven't seen the slides before, so I apologize. But the bottom line is that there is lots of uncertainty. Some uncertainty is very, very hard to quantify. We need to be able to make decisions on this problem. We need to understand the firm's capabilities over and above what we know of the firms in the merger market. So presumably we know a lot about what's going on in the merger market, but what about the other capabilities that the company might have? And this might be a large number of different capabilities that the companies might have. And it would be hard for an authority to ask for everything that the firm does. In the examples that I showed you, and that's why I showed you various examples, the results are mixed. Some mergers are promoting innovation, and some mergers are not promoting innovation. And one theme that showed up is that it matters whether each potential product is complementary to the products in the merger market. That's number one. And number two, whether the future potential products are complementary to each other. Because you could have situations in which the new products are complementary to the merger market, but are complementary in different dimensions and therefore not complementary to each other. So these kind of considerations made a difference in the examples of how whether the merger would promote innovation or not. Then there is the issue that other speakers have already brought up, the issue of appropriability of profits after innovation in different industry structures. That opens a big area because that means that now the competition authority or DOJ would have to have a pretty good understanding of the whole industry structure of many different structures, not just the ones of the merging parties, but also other ones, to be able to understand the appropriability of profits issue. Other speakers have already mentioned the time frame makes a big difference. How quickly are things going to be seen? And this was an issue in the Facebook case when the judge yesterday said, "Oh yeah, now many years have passed. Now we're talking about a different market. Therefore, who cares if you had competition concerns 5 years ago? Now these competition concerns have disappeared because, according to him, the market is in a different stage." So the time framework makes a difference. And this begs the question, should we look at the whole industrial structure in a number of complementary markets, and should we look at the firm's valuations there? That is hard. If we had a kind of regulatory commission and we knew the relevant areas of interest, then they could do it. But for a judge to be able to be presented with a whole bunch of data on industrial structure and a number of complementary markets to make a decision on a very specific merger, I think that sounds very hard. As you can see, the judges have a hard time doing easy cases like the Facebook, Instagram one. We're going to present them with something as complicated as that. That's going to be very hard. Also, if we're going to look at the whole industrial structure, we should consider and evaluate whether we see network effects, whether we see switching costs, and that would make a difference in the appropriability of profits after innovation. And finally, we should always look at efficiencies and whether the innovation would provide some efficiencies in the merger. That's all I have to say. I know I went through quickly, so I apologize, but feel free to ask any questions. Thank you.
Ioannis, you need to unmute.
Yes, sorry, Nick. I hope you can hear me. So this is a quite interesting presentation, a little bit ending on a pessimistic type of note about what we can do in this context, and also, raising the issue of, like, if we are looking to a more broader space than the market, like innovation space or actually the industry, that might eventually lead to quite a lot of information and difficulties, in particular taking into account that we have limited amount of time also to look to a merger. I mean, we have deadlines, and it's not something that can take a long time, as let's say in an abuse case, for instance. So definitely something important to have in mind. And last but not least, Germain, also from an academic perspective. Germain?
Thank you very much, Ioannis and team, for organizing the conference and for having me in this panel. It's my pleasure to be here. Apologies for not being with you in person today. And before I start, I just want to briefly mention that I have absolutely nothing to disclose with respect to this topic. I am sharing my slides with you. You should be able to see them in a second. So maybe Actually, it's perfect. I believe that I'm speaking right after Nick because I will try to give a touch of optimism after this touch of pessimism, and to some extent, and I will try to convince you that the main message that the main takeaway that you can read from the academic literature, and in particular the theoretical literature, is not, or maybe I should say not only, that anything is possible, all the effect is possible. So the way I see, economic theory, when talking about what is relevant for the practice, is that economic theory helps us to understand, of course, what are the various economic effects at play in a given case or something. Taking innovation as an example, we know since, for the past 10, 15 years, we had a lot, for instance, production of economic theoretical models with respect to innovation, and those were by large motivated by those massive mega mergers in the agrochemical industry, for instance. So that's one aspect, understanding the various effects that are at play. This is why economic theory might help. Another aspect is when we have models which are maybe flexible enough or general enough, call them as you wish, those might be informative also in order to build some presumptions which will be very useful. Matias mentioned some presumptions that might be applicable in terms of merger control when we plug in some innovational aspects in there as well. But the last aspect, which is the one I want to spend more time on today, is that economic theory may also be very informative or help us identify some key or sometimes even sufficient statistics which are very useful for operational purpose. And with that in mind, I will take again innovation as an example. I will start with the case of deterministic innovation, which is, maybe the better documented case given the current state of the economic literature. That being said, there is a lot of production in the economic theory, in the academic literature right now, in this direction on stochastic as well innovation, and I will say a few words on that in the next slide. So deterministic innovation, I will focus on one particular paper, but that many of you probably know already, which is that by Bourreau, Le Fouillet, Julien, which is a forthcoming paper in the RAND, Journal of Economics. And they look at a relatively flexible model of a merger when firms, which pre-merger, they are on equal footing, can engage in deterministic innovation. And they decompose the effects of mergers in two different effects. One is what they refer to as the market power effect, and one is the externality effect. For the sake of time, I will not get into too much details and explain to you exactly what is hidden behind. You are very much welcome to refer back to read the papers to understand that. A bit in the same vein as the pointers that Nick just mentioned, which is, when we have complementarities or substitution between products, then this might already provide quite some guidance into the direction, towards what we are going. What we can learn from their paper in that setting with deterministic innovation is that when we have process innovation, then the market power effect in their model would be negative, and there would be no externality effect in their baseline model without innovation spillovers, and therefore the effect of the merger is going to be negative, right? However, when this is product innovation, then they derive some sufficient conditions for mergers to raise or reduce innovation incentives. What can we learn, in terms of actual operational tools from their paper? Very interestingly, so they explain that the externality effect will be captured by the comparison of two different animals that policymakers are very much familiar with. One is the standard price diversion ratio, and another one is the quality or innovation version of it, the innovation diversion ratio. Okay, and the comparison between those two ratios will give us the externality effect. In order to therefore understand the total effect of the merger, we also need to find pointers toward what can be informative to us with respect to the second, that is the market power effect in their paper. In my own work, I also studying similar models, and I show that the comparison of the two diversion ratios that I just mentioned is also helping us to guide to understand Spence-like distortions of quality supply under oligopoly. Spence did it back then for the case of monopoly. reverse engineering a bit their model with respect to mine, then what can be found is that applying the model to changes in concentrations and mergers, the market power effect from Bourreau and al. Actually relates to Spencer's marginal value of quality. What is this? This is simply how much the willingness to pay of a given consumer will change when quality or innovation goes up. And that bump in the willingness to pay of a given consumer might, of course, differ whether we are talking about a consumer who has a low absolute willingness to pay to start with, or a consumer who has a high absolute willingness to pay to start with. Long story short, the conclusion for the practice is that all those three things, price diversion ratio, innovation diversion ratio, and the marginal value of quality, could be measured or estimated, for instance, with the help of surveys and so on and so forth. Of course, this is a relatively costly exercise. It's not that straightforward. It's probably not to be done for every single merger out there. But if we have, mergers that are as big as the Dow, DuPont, and Bayer Monsanto of this world, then, this can be very helpful. I will be a bit more brief on the case of stochastic innovation, but just want to flag, one interesting paper, which is a working paper by Moraga and Gonzalez and Mochenkova, Moraga, Gonzalez, and Mochenkova, where they look at R&D investment, which can affect either the probability of success of an innovation or the outcome. Is that a big or a small innovation? Okay, and what they find is that what is driving the effect of the merger on innovation is going to be the difference between the pre-merger arrow replacement effect compared to the post-merger arrow replacement effect, okay? And what is interesting is that that difference depends on whether or not the other firm, the partner firm in the merger, is successful itself in innovation. What they find is also a very interesting conclusion, is that when this arrow replacement effect is going to be greater post-merger than pre-merger regardless of the partner's success, or when it is smaller post-merger than pre-merger regardless of the partner's success, then they can determine the effects of the merger on R&D investments. When this is not the case, that is when this is going to be greater in one case and smaller in the other case, then they explain that pre-merger R&D investment levels, or more specifically, the cost function of R&D pre-merger, but the levels of pre-merger R&D investment might be informative about that, can help us to understand the effect of the merger on stochastic innovation. In a related paper, work in progress with Armin Schmutzler, I studied the impact of stricter merger control on both an incumbent and an entrant innovation incentives. And just to give you a flavor of what we are doing here and how that relates to the work of Moraga Gonzalez, and how that can be helpful also to understand whether or not this arrow replacement effect is going to be greater post-merger than pre-merger regardless of partner success and so on and so forth in their paper, then we have a slightly more tailored model, let's say, and one of the versions of the model is one where the entrant can only enter at a low scale level. That is, the entrant, even if they enter the market, if they are successful in their innovation, which allows them to enter the market, then they will remain less strong than the incumbent. In that case, the effects of a stricter merger control on the entrance incentive to invest are quite simple, because we only have this buyouts, this entry for buyouts effect for the entrants. However, what is more interesting are the effects on the incumbents' incentives to invest. And what we find is that those effects on the incumbents' innovation incentives are driven by whether or not a high state for the incumbent, that is, high innovation for the incumbent only, is going to boost the total pre-merger duopoly profit more than the monopoly profits, conditional on entry of the entrant. And this is going to be directly related to the arrow replacement effect that is mentioned in the Moraga Gonzalez and Mochenkova paper. it's maybe most of it we just have to add in our model another small ingredient which is relatively to determine. Long story short, for the practice in R&D intensive industries where R&D is an important part of the overall firm strategy, actually internal documents or other quantitative analysis which are performed by the firms pre-merger in particular, of course, might provide some insights about the size of those arrow replacement effects and might be very helpful indicators of the effect of the merger even before the merger takes place. As a conclusion, I want very briefly to talk about some limitations which are typically not discussed in the academic literature that is assumed away from the theoretical models. One is a classical question when we want to talk about innovation is how to accurately quantify innovation or quality. Of course, in the model, this is a well-defined discrete state or continuous variables, but in practice, it's not always that easy. Investment is obviously a starting point, but different firms might have different abilities, and therefore this might make the whole exercise a bit more complicated. Patents is another starting point, of course, but it's known to be also an imperfect measure of innovation. I don't have any clear answer to this problem. This is just to point out that there are some built-in limits to looking at economic theory. And the second point I want to mention with respect to limitation is that of a time frame, which has already been mentioned by several of the previous speakers. The idea is, of course, that in the very, very, very long run, anything can happen. Sorry. And this time frame is typically not considered by the academic literature, theoretical literature, when looking at merger-related research questions. One interesting exception, however, is a very recent paper forthcoming in AEJ Micro by Das, Maiskaya, and Nikandrova, where they look at the effect of mergers on innovation in a real dynamic game. And they are able not only to discuss what kind of innovation is going to might be under some conditions fostered or harmed by the merger, but they also discuss some various interesting aspects which are specific to this paper, which is whether or not an innovation might be brought forward in time thanks to the merger, or could possibly, in theory, also be pushed to a later stage. Now, obviously, this is going to create some extra difficulties with respect to the legal analysis, because if mergers might push innovations forward in time or to a later stage, it's already difficult to find what would be the interaction between time frame and legal test and legal threshold. And if on top of that, the effects are going to be fully endogenous in the time dimension, thanks to the merger, then this makes everything a bit more complicated. So those are some obvious limitations from the theory. Nonetheless, I want to end on the optimistic note, and that there is a lot to gain from the theoretical academic literature for the practice. It's not always easy. It's not always easy to apply. It's not always easy to spot. It's sometimes well hidden in papers. Sometimes we have to build bridges between various contributions. But I think a lot of the insights are already there.
Thank you very much, Germain. A very interesting presentation. So I'm afraid we're running out of time. So we have 7 minutes to share. For those of you that would like to make a comment on what has been discussed, maybe starting with Matias. Yeah. If you can keep it in 1 minute, if possible. Well, yes.
Actually, would like to comment on what Germain just said. So you mentioned very relevant papers there, and I agree that when it comes to the effect of mergers on innovation alone, and this also goes to what Nicholas was saying, the effect is ambiguous. You can have indeed that the merger improves innovation, but when you look at the consumer surplus effect, accounting for pricing effects, then I think the takeaway from both the Buchholz paper and the Moraga paper is that expected consumer surplus will actually go down. In Moraga paper, there's one example where it goes up, but that's a very specific example. And even in there, you need to have some parameter values where it happens. The paper by Das is, I think, one of the only, or maybe the only proper paper that actually has a positive impact on consumer surplus, accounting for pricing effects. But there, I think the result is driven by informational spillover. So So that would be something that we would in practice look at as an efficiency.
Okay.
So I would
that's
still
the
keep the
last-
presumption that the
Yeah.
effect on consumers is absent efficiency is negative.
All right, and that will be the burden will be on the parties.
The burden would be typically on the parties, of course.
Anyone online has any comments? I know Aviv, there was a question for him, but he left. What are the primitives? He mentioned about primitives, so there's a question about that. But anyone online would like to?
Just, if I may, just 10 seconds. I fully agree with what Matias just said. Just to be clear, I did not claim to say that I was talking about the presumptions. And I fully agree with Matias about the presumptions. Absolutely not. As I mentioned, this was to identify a couple of relevant points, maybe in order to rebut those presumptions and so on and so forth. But I fully agree with Matias in that dimension.
Okay, very good. Okay.
I just had a quick one, Matias. I find it really interesting your point, which I think makes sense, that you sort of retain the two-step approach. So if you find a reduction in innovation, you then look for the efficiencies. But you made the point that perhaps things like the merger specificity requirement needs to be kind of a bit less draconian. And I was just wondering, so I think we all, as economists, we get the mechanism for sort of internalizing spillovers, for the complementarity. I just wondered if you had a sense of what you would find convincing to actually evidence that those spillovers were present to the degree necessary to offset the presumptions that you had in mind. I realize it's a hard question to answer in the abstract, but would be interested.
It has to be some sort of imperfect appropriability, imperfect patent protection there. Maybe that would give rise to involuntary spillovers that then lead to a situation where the one who is making the innovation effort is not getting all the benefits, and then a merger can indeed internalize those spillovers and be beneficial. So that would depend on the case, but if it's a market where you have patent protection, and if patent protection works well, then I suppose there would be limited scope for such spillovers. On the contrary, if the type of innovation that is done is difficult to protect with intellectual property rights, then that might be one. Yeah.
So, any further thoughts? Yes, Cecilia?
Yeah, sorry. So in the way you talked about innovation efficiencies and sort of the way the discussion has gone, my understanding is that the sort of 3 criteria that currently are part of the framework of the Commission, of the way the Commission assesses efficiencies, would still be applicable. I realize that sort of the approach is kind of evolving, and the thinking behind that as well. But I think the sort of 3 sort of criteria are likely to still remain: so verifiability, merger specificity, and benefits. Do you envisage relaxing potentially in the way the criteria are applied, in the sense of the sort of threshold for satisfying this criteria might change in light of the fact that when we talk about innovation efficiencies, again, sort of inherently uncertainty is a lot bigger than even sort of in terms of the kind of normal efficiencies?
I can only speak in my personal capacity. It's an ongoing drafting exercise. I would think that, especially when it comes to innovation efficiencies, we should be pretty open to claims on efficiency defenses, especially if there are spillovers or complementarities that actually make the merger improve the position in the innovation race against outsiders. But that doesn't mean that indeed the framework has to be changed. It could still be maintained, but then depending on the type of efficiency, that's
All right. Well, thank you very much to the panelists of the second panel, and thank you very much to those of you that have been contributing online. We don't really have too much time for a pause. I mean, you can grab your coffee, come back. Those of you are online, I think you don't have that problem. So we'll start the third panel, and I would like to ask Jacques Steenbergen to come and chair this panel, and also the other speakers as well to join me here. And we have already online Fiona Scott-Morton, I can see. Hopefully the other speakers will join us shortly as well. Eleanor Fox as well is there. Daniela Calisti is there. Really apologies, we were running a little bit late, which is not surprising in view of the number of speakers in each panel. I was afraid it would be even worse. And I give the floor to Jacques